Many Eastern religions and New Age traditions believe in some form of physical rebirth, or reincarnation, but you don't need faith to think it happens.
Actually, yeah, you kinda do.
Over the last 60 years, researchers have documented several thousand cases in which young children recalled the events of a previous life in such detail that those experiences could be confidently matched to recently deceased individuals. Though this evidence has been largely rejected by mainstream science.
There's a reason for that, bud.
In all the Indian religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, and Jainism, it is believed that people are fated for an endless cycle of rebirth, as humans, animals, or even plants, according to the tradition, unless they manage to escape. In Hinduism, it is thought that one is reincarnated into better or worse conditions according to one's karma, while other traditions hold that you can plan your next rebirth.
Wow, that sounds pretty shitty if you ask me. Most of these Eastern religions admit that life is suffering, so to keep coming back and doing it again and again is akin to some kind of hell. And the whole karmatic system of rebirth dependent upon actions in your previous lives is kind of stupid. Because if you don't retain that ego or personality and essentially get reset each time, you're a new person for all intents and purposes, and as such, you have to suffer because of the actions of a complete stranger in history that just happens to share the same soul or whatever. And there are almost 8 billion people on the earth now. Where are all these extra souls coming from? Nobody seems to remember having a past life as a plant or some shit.
Tibetan Buddhism holds that every Dalai Lama since the 15th century has been the same person reincarnated more than a dozen times. Before every death, he instructs his followers on where to find him in his next life.
I'm gonna be somewhere around here and I'll look like a baby.
However, the idea of reincarnation was discussed amongst the Greeks, and entered the Western consciousness when Renaissance thinkers began translating Pythagoras and Plato after the 14th century. In the 19th century, Nietzsche and Schopenhauer commented on the idea of rebirth as presented in the Indian scriptures.
Hey, you leave my boy Nietzsche out of this. Maybe I'm wrong, but I interpreted Nietzsche's ideas to be more about eternal recurrence, as in the universe itself repeats this timeline infinitely. So he's not talking about being reborn into a new body and having a new life. I think he means that all of us will unknowingly repeat our existence ad infinitum. Of course, I don't believe that, but that's what he meant.
Reincarnation did not come under the scrutiny of Western science until the late 1950s. It began with Ian Stevenson, a Canadian physician and psychiatrist, and after 1957, head of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Virginia.
Now, before we get too far into this, I just want to point out that pretty much everyone they reference from here on out is either Ian Stevenson himself or someone who studies the work of Ian Stevenson.
Stevenson had an interest in parapsychology, and in 1960, he authored a review of the published evidence for reincarnation. The article caught the attention of the founder of the Parapsychology Foundation, who gave Stevenson a grant to interview a child in India claiming past life memories. After interviewing the child, he interviewed several others claiming past life memories, then documented several more cases in Sri Lanka, Brazil, Alaska, and Lebanon.
So he basically got the Parapsychology Foundation to pay for his round trip around the globe.
On the basis of these interviews, he published the seminal book, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, in 1966.
Out of 4,000 interviews, he has a few handfuls of people he claims are credible.
This book represented the first time cases of past life memories had been presented as anything other than anecdotes. It introduced the first data on reincarnation.
Well, to be fair, the data in question is still mostly just anecdotes. Writing anecdotes down doesn't suddenly lend credence to them.
Stevenson's evidence was convincing. In about half of all cases, researchers or family members were able to identify the past life persona, and in many cases, meet with surviving relatives. In some cases, Stevenson interviewed the child and the family before they connected with the past life family, and accompanied them on their first contacts so he could note who and what the children were able to recognize. He was confident that he had nearly ruled out fraud in the vast majority of cases.
What? So let me get this straight. A man with a preconceived notion went into the fields to conduct completely uncontrolled experiments, based on the testimony of 2 to 5-year-old toddlers that were filtered through a translator that he himself admitted was dishonest, and the litmus test for fraud was just his own personal perception?
Every time a past life match was identified, Stevenson was able to verify at least a few of the claims made by the children.
But not all the claims. That's the one thing that gets me about his research. He includes all the hits, but none of the misses. He cultivates his own confirmation bias.
In hundreds of cases, researchers were able to verify scores of very specific claims, such as names of past life relatives, past life occupations, and causes of death. For example, an Indian boy named Ravi Shankar recalled from the age of 2 or 3 a previous life in which he'd been beheaded by a scheming relative. Shankar was able to recall the names of the murderers, the weapon used, and the location of the crime, among other details, all of which corresponded to a real case in a nearby village.
Yeah, if it took place in a nearby village, maybe the kid overheard an adult talking about it.
At the same time, Dr. Helen Wambach, a clinical psychologist at JFK University, set out to prove that past life memories were all fantasy. She began a 10-year survey of past life memories retrieved from hypnotized people asked to relive a previous life, and recount specific details about such things as the clothing they wore, the jobs they worked, and the tools they used in their day-to-day lives. When checked against known historical realities, all but 11 of the over 1,000 subjects reported highly accurate information, right down to the utensils and footwear of previous peoples. Wambach became so convinced in the accuracy of past life recall that she went on to conduct a study of over 2,500 people using hypnotic progression, though only a small fraction of her subjects were able to place themselves in future lives, and the information could not be verified.
Wait, did he just say future lives?
Subjects were able to place themselves in future lives.
Well, yeah, I imagine it's hard to remember things that haven't happened yet. As for hypnotic regression, progression, it's not really solid evidence. Actually, it's not even really evidence. As for Helen Wambach, she's kind of a nutbar herself. When she interviewed people, she would ask why they came back in the 20th century because she believed it was the end times of Revelation and that the second coming was at hand.
The University of Virginia database now contains roughly 2,500 cases of alleged reincarnation and past life recall. Most cases come from Asian countries more sympathetic to the idea of rebirth, with only about 10% originating in the West, but the phenomenon is global.
Wow, what a fucking surprise! People who come from cultures that believe in reincarnation have lots of bullshit claims about it. And cultures that don't believe in it much, mysteriously don't experience it much either.
Although there are many cases of adults having spontaneous past life recall, in most instances, memories are recalled from the ages of 2 or 3, and lost completely between the ages of 5 and 8. About 70% of all cases involve memories of a violent death, for reasons that are unclear. Some people even claim to remember their existence between lives, and recall entering their new body before or after birth.
I don't know, that's a pretty big discrepancy, before or after birth.
Stevenson found that children with past life recall often inherit the physical and behavioral characteristics of their past life incarnations. Many are born with birthmarks, sores, and deformities, corresponding with significant marks on their previous bodies.
Why would that be the case? We have genetic and environmental explanations for these things. Why do we need to add a supernatural one? And even if you were to buy into this completely unfounded and antithetical to reality concept of a soul, why would it carry that sort of biological information with it? I mean, there's no reason why any aspect of your consciousness or personality would carry on, but it's downright absurd to think that old wounds from the cells of an old body would imprint themselves on your soul and then cause marks on the cells of your new body. Ian Stevenson, being a psychologist and not a scientist, made the mistake of coming up with a hypothesis, then going out to cherry-pick examples that would prove his preconception and discard the rest. Then he stretches the limits of plausibility and makes wild assumptions about the nature of both souls and biology in order to shove the puzzle piece he wants into the wrong fucking space.
For example, many people killed by gunshot are reincarnated into bodies with birthmarks corresponding to the entry and exit wounds of the lethal bullet. In the Tlingit culture, people are sometimes branded with personalized body tags, which appear on later babies. As Stevenson and Semke discovered in the late 1990s, facial features are often preserved between lives as well, as photo comparisons attest.
Well, as Ian points out in his work, most people who claim to have reincarnated typically have past lives in the same culture or even region their current life is in. So it's not that unusual for a person born in Ireland to look somewhat like another Irish person. They are shared genetic traits there regardless. And the photo they use here doesn't help their case at all. These guys only look mildly similar because they have the same kind of mustache.
Semke has also presented evidence that people can reincarnate in groups. For example, he has made the case that he and all the presidential candidates in the 2000 American election had lived previous lives in politics during the American Revolution.
Oh really? His research just happened to lead him to discover that he is John Adams? And that he gets to lump himself in with not only the Founding Fathers, but with all of the 2000 election candidates? Wow, what an incredibly lucky and self-aggrandizing coincidence!
Individuals reincarnated after a violent passing typically exhibit a phobia of their past life cause of death.
Oh yeah, nobody's afraid of drowning unless they did it in a past life, duh!
For example, an Indian girl named Uttara Hudar periodically identified as a Bengali girl named Sharada, who claimed to have been killed by a snake bite to the right big toe. Though Uttara did not share her consciousness with Sharada, she had a strong fear of snakes.
Oh, a girl in a place with deadly snakes was afraid of deadly snakes? What are the chances?
Most strikingly, people with past life memories can sometimes speak the language of their past life identity, even when they had no opportunity to learn the language in their present life.
Sometimes when people wake up from a coma or get brain damage, they start speaking another language. And in some cases, it's been a language they never learned. It's known as bilingual aphasia. So although it's weird, it's not a supernatural phenomenon.
The global median intermission time, or the time between the death of the past life individual and the birth of the reincarnated child, is about 15 months, but specific times reflect cultural assumptions, as do other factors. In the West, for example, it's much more common to have intermissions spanning decades, while it's rarely much more than a year in most Asian cultures.
Hey! Why do the Asians get a fast track? Just because they invented the shit?
In patriarchal societies, it's more common for people to reincarnate along their father's bloodline, whereas in matriarchal societies, it's more common to reincarnate along the mother's. In all cultures, however, it is most common to reincarnate nearby to one's previous life, and within a familiar cultural group. People also tend to reincarnate as the same sex.
All this tells me is that people are very unimaginative.
The data on reincarnation demonstrate that past life memories are highly accurate in at least half of all cases.
Highly accurate? Whoa there, don't go overboard, bud. Shit was tangential correlation at best. And if half the cases were accurate, then the other half of the cases were inaccurate.
However, the reaction from academia has been lukewarm at best, though Stevenson did get some early praise in the mid-1970s. The Journal of the American Medical Association claimed that the cases presented were difficult to explain on any assumption other than reincarnation. The Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease devoted an entire issue to Stevenson's work, in which psychiatrist Harold Leaf remarked that Stevenson might one day be known as the Galileo of the 20th century.
Hold up, let's see the actual quote for context. Either he, Dr. Stevenson, is making a colossal mistake, or he will be known as the Galileo of the 20th century.
Even Carl Sagan, a noted debunker of anomalous phenomena, said that the research on reincarnation was convincing and ought to be continued.
Hey, you leave my boy Carl Sagan out of this. He most certainly did not say that it was convincing, quite the opposite. He said that he didn't think there was any validity to it at all, but that it should still be researched. He even said the evidence collected was dubious. But Carl Sagan didn't want science to be authoritarian. He felt no idea should be dismissed offhand if someone was willing to research it. So his support of Ian's research isn't the same as an endorsement of the claims.
Skeptics maintain that the supposedly reincarnated children could have learned of their past life personas through other means, and that the researchers' bias led them to accept a paranormal explanation where a simpler one would have sufficed. The debate over reincarnation reflects a wider debate over the nature of the human mind and its relationship to the natural world. The dominant assumption amongst most Western academics is that consciousness is entirely reducible to physical activity in the brain. In this view, it's assumed that when the physical body dies, one's conscious experience ends, and one's personality, spirit, or soul ceases to exist. If this is true, then it would be impossible for any aspect of a person to survive bodily death, let alone to reincarnate in another form. The very possibility of reincarnation requires a new theory of consciousness that holds it to be independent of the human body.
Well, outside of materialism, you have nothing but metaphysics, and I believe the dictionary definition includes the line, abstract theory with no basis in reality, which is a pretty accurate description if you ask me. From what I can gather, almost all of the alleged science behind reincarnation stems from the work of Ian, and as I pointed out before, that is entirely based on the translated anecdotes of 2 to 5-year-old children and some assumptions about coincidental birthmarks, many of which were not nearly as corresponding as he made them out to be. His research did not follow the standard procedure of the scientific method, and his translator was both reputedly dishonest and already a believer in reincarnation. So the fact he produced a small amount of very questionable evidence could easily be chalked up to a margin of error. Like Carl Sagan, I don't discourage anyone from continuing this line of inquiry, but given what we already do know about the nature of reality, I do think it's a fool's errand. But people desperately want to believe there's some chance their persona will continue on after death, so there's always going to be a motive to look in a dark room for a black cat that doesn't exist.